we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Coming up this week,
Donald Trump took Elon Musk and Jensen Huang to Beijing with him for 48 hours. But rather than the frat boy big weekend of their autistic dreams, the trip turned into a sequel to The Hangover. A dressing down from Xi on Iran, a few more soybeans flogged, and some Boeings on order. Was it really worth Jensen's $17,000 an hour time?
Meanwhile, the Japanese 10-year bond yield has climbed above the Chinese one. This is something of a sorpasso. As the country struggles to keep its debt load manageable, there's a sense of sag to the economy. Does the Japan of our techno-futurist imaginations now bear the same degree of relation to reality as the Italy of our Fellini fantasies?
Finally, another sorpasso. Mexican birth rates have dropped below those of America for the first time. Problem being, if the Mexicans don't have sex, they can't supply the US with a constant source of surplus labour.
US conservatives have long been scornful of European immigration patterns, falling back on the cultural compatibility of their southern neighbours. But unless Pablo and Maria get back in the bedroom, they'll soon be receiving the same rich blend of Africans and Middle Easterners as the EU.
But first,
Huawei with the Fairies.
This week's big story in diplomacy was the visit of Donald Trump to China to meet Xi Jinping. But it wasn't a big story because nothing actually happened. I mean, what happened at the end of the day? Well, China agreed to buy, $17 billion worth of agricultural goods, apparently. But, in the past, last year, I believe, they promised to buy a whole bunch of American soybeans and just didn't. Americans, for their part, agreed to let China buy NVIDIA GPU chips, but are the Chinese going to buy those chips? It seems at the moment they're very keen to give their indigenous chip industry a boost, and it seems that for AI purposes, all the Chinese companies buy the Huawei Ascend series of chips and use Huawei architecture to build computing power and AI training data centers for that sort of thing. So, I mean, how many NVIDIA chips are actually going to be purchased? I mean, certainly it would be foolish to become reliant on them and give the US a great deal of leverage again, right? So that's not going to be a serious thing at all. And what was left? Well, Xi gave Trump a kind of dressing down about how the United States is a declining power and how it had better keep its hands off Taiwan and how ultimately the two powers could get along. But if the US doesn't change its behavior, especially when it comes to Taiwan, then the relationship could end in blows. Yeah, I mean, that was it. That, and this, of course, is a statement of fact. It was really a massive nothing burger. So why was it a nothing burger? Look, it's very simple. The reason it was a nothing burger, the reason that nothing serious got decided on, is because the US is in such a strategically weak position. And it's in a strategically weak position because of the whole Iran debacle that is currently ongoing. And because of that, it is in no position to negotiate anything based on its intrinsic strength. And the US, if it could exfiltrate itself from all of these strategic morasses which it insists on rushing headlong toward, is still an extremely powerful nation with a very large economy, tremendous economic breadth and depth. It has a great deal of things from NVIDIA microchips through to financial services and a whole lot more that the rest of the world would want. It still controls a great deal of the world's financial flows. So it is a powerful nation, but the point is that it's in a geostrategically weak position at the moment, and therefore it made sense from a US perspective just to keep things light. Now, I think perhaps Trump would have liked some help on Iran, but it's frankly preposterous to imagine that China is going to help bail out the US from strategic messes that it's got into so that Washington can better seek to hobble the Chinese economy and contain China strategically. So that was always off the table. So what was left was a kind of minimal series of mini agreements, essentially, to show that something had been gained from this meeting, and also to maintain relations between the two great powers in the Pacific. And that was that. It was a nothing burger. There was a mild humiliation for Donald Trump. One thing that has been making the press, and the press coverage, for understandable reasons, has been very minor here because so little was achieved, and that which was achieved was mildly humiliating for Trump personally and the US more broadly. But one thing the press are focusing on, Philip, is that Donald Trump refused to answer a question when asked whether the United States would indeed defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese military attack. And Trump simply refused to answer the question. He said, no, I'm not answering this question, and it's not on the table for me there. A lot of people are making a great deal of that. They're arguing somehow that Trump has backed down or he has been cowed by Xi. No, that's not the case. We must be fair to Donald Trump here. As much as we have criticized his foreign policy on this podcast, we must be fair to him. The point is that the United States, still to this day, adheres to what's known as the One China policy. So you can go on the US State Department's website and read this. It's all there. But it recognizes Taiwan as an intrinsic part of China. The United States does not recognize Taiwan as an independent nation. It recognizes it as part of China. And an intrinsic part of the US policy on Taiwan is something known as strategic ambiguity. They have maintained ambiguity about how far they would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack, if at all. They leave everybody guessing. It's a subtle and rather elegant way of solving the problem while at the same time maintaining a certain degree of deterrence. That seemed to change under Joe Biden, but that was when Biden seemed to be completely off his rocker. He was completely senile. And when he was asked whether the United States would defend Taiwan, he kept saying yes. I think he did it 4 or 5 times. One time, in fact, particularly to the chagrin of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who literally sank his head in despair when Biden said that they would defend Taiwan, because it quite literally went against his own government's policy. So no, Trump hasn't backed down. Nothing's changed there. So again, that is a nothing burger. The chips is a nothing burger because the Chinese might buy a few, but not many. It might save them some money from having to buy a few NVIDIA chips on the grey or black market. Will they buy this agricultural stuff? Maybe not. They certainly didn't buy the soybeans. The dressing down was newsworthy, a mild humiliation for the US. But that's it. That's all that was achieved. Unless you've got something to add, Philip Pilkington.
Something on the Taiwan issue, and I wouldn't fault you at not noticing this, because, as you said, the coverage of this has been so lacking, strange. I'll get back to that in a moment. But Rubio did an interview with MSNBC. It wasn't widely publicized, but if you follow the kind of politics Twitter, you'd have seen it. And in it, he said, and I quote, "I think China's preference is probably to have Taiwan willingly, voluntarily join them. In a perfect world, what they would want is some vote or referendum in Taiwan that agrees to fold in. I think that's what they would prefer." And then later on in the same interview, he basically signals that that's what the United States would prefer too. He just says, we don't want any more disruptions and so on. So I think on the Taiwan question, there was some rhetorical movement by the United States. I'm a bit mystified, as what you're alluding to, that nothing else really happened. To my mind, the Taiwan thing was a big chip to play for the Americans. When Trump first got in, actually before Trump got in, I wrote a paper for the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs where I outlined why they should try and strike a new Bretton Woods agreement with the Chinese. And part of this would have been, it was effectively a Keynesian Bancor system. And what it would have meant was a new monetary architecture that tries to balance trade. And from the Chinese perspective, this would have required increased foreign direct investment flows into the United States while there's an outstanding current account deficit to rebuild up American industry. And to my mind, I mean, I didn't say it explicitly in the paper, but I said it to people I knew. I said it to people I know in DC too. You should trade Taiwan for this, effectively. I mean, that's what you should do. And what surprised me about the trip was that everything seemed lined up for that. For that very outcome. So, for example, Jensen Huang was there, the NVIDIA CEO, and Elon Musk was there, looking a little bit tired, as people noted on Twitter. And to my mind, that was the perfect opportunity, because what industries do the US now need to partner with China on? Chips and EVs. Why? Because China's going to outpace them in both industries. The United States tried to outcompete them through some sort of forceful trade war strategy. We criticized it constantly on the show. It didn't work. I think it's now widely acknowledged that that didn't work. And so the logical thing to do then is to partner with the Chinese and say, yeah, sure, come into the American market, but we want like majority ownership of BYD America, or rebrand, integrate BYD into Tesla or something like that. This is somewhat similar to what happened with the Japanese automotive sector in the West. Toyota came in, but if you're in Europe, I don't know who the CEO of Toyota Europe is, but it's probably not a Japanese guy these days. It's probably a German guy or a French guy or something like that. Ditto in America, it's probably an American guy. And, the ownership structure is mixed and so on. So all the moving parts were there for basically what I was advocating at the beginning of the Trump administration. And again, this idea was definitely circulated at some level. I can say that for sure. And yet there was no outcome. Now, I wonder if it needs time. I wonder if America had to go there and kind of eat crow a little bit, which they did. And then over time, they can rebuild some trust with the Chinese. If people follow me on Twitter, they'll probably have noticed I wasn't actually very critical I was very supportive of the entire trip, and I didn't even highlight the Xi speech about American decline and so on. And although it is very notable, I mean, that was the most notable outcome of the trip, and that's what it'll be remembered for in the history books. Yet at the same time, I think that the relationship should be given a little bit of time to breathe. I actually think the Chinese were a little harsh, personally, but you don't know what went on behind the scenes. And the other thing to remember about this is the Chinese insisted for this trip that the Americans pursue normal diplomatic protocol. So the Trump administration has a terrible habit of sort of rocking in, would be the technical diplomatic term, rocking into a country and just kind of shooting from the hip and so on. It hasn't been a success, by the way, to the extent that it's been done. And the Chinese basically said, we're not having the trip without normal diplomatic protocol. And what normal diplomatic protocol means is, State Department to Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, diplomatic ties, extensive negotiations before the trip happens, right down to small aspects of etiquette and so on. And that's why, if you saw the visuals of it, it was a very structured trip. And it was, and the Chinese gave Trump a great welcome, even if Xi did make that comment. So it's a bit confusing. I think the optimistic reading is that the Chinese basically said, come over, eat a little bit of crow. You've been acting like a gorilla for about 18 months now, and we've been very unhappy. Well, actually, you've been kind of acting like a gorilla since 2016. And I don't just mean Trump, I mean the Biden administration too. And they said, come over, eat a bit of crow. We'll put on a good show for you. We'll be respectful. We won't treat you like the Europeans and put you on the stinky bus. We won't put you on the homeless bus. But, we'll come over, we'll give you a good show, but you're going to have to tolerate a little bit of a mild spanking. And then, we'll do more trips and we'll do more exchanges and so on. And if we can build trust up, maybe we'll get to the point that I'm talking about, where, we effectively trade the Taiwan issue in peaceful terms, as Rubio laid it out. We don't want a war. The Chinese have no interest in invading or blockading Taiwan if they can get it through voting and so on. And then, we'll figure out the economic situation after. So that will be the optimistic reading. But overall, it was an incredibly strange trip. We were just saying before we started recording, Gavin, the producer, was saying he was barely aware of it. Just because the media coverage was so scant. The most indicative aspect of the media coverage came out today. We're recording on Tuesday. So this morning, the front page of the Financial Times, I don't know if the physical copy had it, but the front page of the Financial Times on the website had a headline. I mean, this was their main story. Had a headline saying Xi Jinping told Donald Trump that Putin might, quote, regret invasion of Ukraine. And I immediately said that didn't happen. There's absolutely no way that that happened, because Putin is going to Taiwan or to China in a few weeks or 2 weeks or something like that. And that'll be a big trip. And, the Trump trip and the Putin trip will be linked. So I, clicked through onto the story and I read it. Classic, anonymous source familiar with blah, blah, blah. Now, FT pulled this trick all the time. I called them Pravda on the Thames on Twitter because, it's becoming a kind of a clown newspaper, like Daily Mail-esque, for dumping stories that are poorly sourced. But even when they do this, they rarely, elevate it to a big scoop or whatever. So it was very tacky. I checked, Washington Post didn't even cover the story today. I mean, that says it all, right? I mean, FT is turning into a dumping ground for junk, actually, for junk reporting. And then today at lunchtime, so that came out this morning, European time, and at lunchtime, European time, the Chinese MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, I should say, came out, clipped the article and said just completely false. Completely false. They said it was a completely fake story. Now, why am I dwelling on this? Because the West is in a really, really weird place right now. The lack of coverage around the China trip, the optics of the trip being so China dominant in a sense, and the FT coming out with this obviously fake story. I mean, I didn't even have to read the body of the text to know it was a fake story, because why would Xi Jinping say that before Putin comes over for a trip? It's so stupid. It's so obviously prima facie dumb. I worry that the West is sort of entering into an information vacuum. As the decline of the West and the rise of the rest of the world becomes increasingly obvious, I fear that we're going to be fed kind of slop, honestly. That we're not actually going to have global events communicated to us properly. We'll occasionally get a cope story like this, a clear cope story. And a bunch of people in London and in Europe will have read the Financial Times headline and they won't know that the Chinese MFA spokesperson came out and said it was completely false. It's really strange and it's really scary, and I don't like the idea of living in mainly Europe, but the West in general, where an information bubble starts to form and we start to live in kind of a fantasy world. And I fear that the coverage of that China trip might be the beginning of something like that. Now, it won't last forever. Nothing lasts forever, but it could last quite a long time. It could last a decade.
Well, yes, I think you and I have spoken before about the problem of this. And in fact, one of the key advantages that the West always had over the rest of the world was a keen and free press. This idea that democracy had its negative aspects, for instance, the speed at which it could move, the messiness and the compromises needed to succeed politically in a democracy, the fact that you have to sell a political program to individual interest groups which may not have the overall long-term interests of the country at heart. Yeah, those are all negatives, but one of the great strengths of democracy, and when I say democracy, I don't just mean the act of voting. I mean the kind of like the free Western, liberal democracy as a way of organizing society, was the freedom of information. Information wasn't suppressed in the same way that it was in, say, the Soviet Union or other perhaps older societies, pre-democratic societies. And this acted as a key check on foolishness, right? Like, you acted foolishly, and some muckraking journalist would unearth this foolish move, and that person who acted in that way would get sacked or kicked out or chastened sufficiently to alter course. Now, if we're going to move into a make-believe world now, then that great strength of course alteration and having your gut checked all the time, and the protection against absolute idiots, is going to be removed. And I think we see it all of the time, where in international relations, certainly in Ukraine and to a certain degree in other conflicts, there's been a great information war gone on The press, and certainly in Britain, I would say, but I think to a certain degree in the United States and Europe as well, I think it's reasonable to say, have allowed themselves to be co-opted into this. And unfortunately, what it's doing is it is kind of psyoping the people who wanted the propaganda to begin with. It's psyoping Western leaders. It's leaving Western leaders short of the information they need to make good decisions. It is leaving them in the dark. Essentially, they're running propaganda operations on themselves. And I can really see this becoming a problem right now, in fact. Regarding the Taiwan issue, yes, I think that is a major chip that the US has to deal. But I don't think they were ever going to even start dealing it now, so to speak, because they're just so strategically weak at the moment. They're in such a mess in Iran, and they obviously desperately want to end that as a conflict. And they're facing, or they have been strategically defeated. They have suffered a strategic defeat, and it's been an almighty one. They haven't even managed to secure a single, not one, operational victory within the war. Not a single one. Not one. And if you think otherwise, then please write in the comments to name one single operational victory, let alone a strategic victory, which they've failed completely to achieve. So they've been defeated in this war, and they're desperately scrambling to find a way out before planet Earth gets hit with the most almighty of oil shocks in history and sees the whole global economy go into the dirt because of US actions. And the US would get hit by that as well, no matter what people say. So they're in a kind of weak position at the moment. So it was always likely, as I say, that they were going to keep this really to a minimum, because the last thing that you want to do when you're in a weak position is go into a negotiation on, really big, serious issues. It would be like, getting into a fight with the neighborhood bully right after you got really sick. You don't want to do that. You want to keep relations with that guy that you ultimately want to take on, or ultimately want to find a resolution with, until you've regained at least some of your strength from the illness. That's the situation that the US is in right now. But eventually, Philip, I think you're right. I think Taiwan is going to go, and it is a major chip, and the US could probably ask for a pretty serious price for it. Marco Rubio is correct that what the Chinese want to do is they want to slowly draw Taiwan farther and farther and farther into the Chinese orbit, because China is so powerful now economically that it is perfectly natural for Taiwan to want to trade an increasing amount with China. And as it trades more and more with China, it makes more and more sense to, open up Chinese markets and Taiwanese markets, have more free movement of labor between the two countries, have some kind of alignment on regulations, maybe even tariffs, because, it will just be so profitable for Taiwan to do that. In the same way that it was profitable for the Czech Republic to want to join the EU so that it could trade more freely with Germany. So it's even more the case with Taiwan, right? Like the difference between the two is even greater. So that's what China wants to do. It wants to slowly catch your monkey, so to speak. And you saw it recently with the head of the opposition, the kind of the more pro-China party, the KMT, went to China recently, and China really love-bombed her when it came to some of the things that they offered. And I think that's what the Chinese want to, that's what Beijing wants to do. It wants to do things in a positive way. The only way they're going to invade, right? There are only two reasons that they're going to invade. One is that the US tries to arrange some kind of color revolution where Taiwan moves towards declaring independence, or does declare independence, or agitates in that direction, and the Chinese feel they're losing control of the situation. Or if they see a window of opportunity. So the Trump administration is about to try to force through the Congress like a 50% increase in US military in the US military budget. Maybe China think, well, another 5 years of that, and they might start closing the military gap. They might start filling some of the problems they've got, because at the moment they've got no possible way of deterring the Chinese from attacking. So maybe Beijing looks and says, right, there's a window of opportunity and we need to move now. But I think their preference is, as Marco Rubio quite rightly said, it is long-standing Chinese policy to reunify with Taiwan peacefully, and explicitly they say peacefully, and that military action would be on the table in the event of Taiwan moving decisively farther away from that reunification. And so I think that's the situation at the moment, is nothing was going to be decided on Taiwan because of US weakness at the moment, their particular weakness at the moment. But it's very much on the table for the future, and I think it will be dealt in the future, and it might be dealt sooner rather than later.
Well, I just add in that Taiwan's about to go through a major energy crisis. It's an island, and it imports all its oil and gas and so on. I think a lot of it comes from the Gulf, which is currently closed.
I mean, I think one thing to look for, by the way, it's not going to be... One thing readers should not be fooled into thinking of this as a kind of all or nothing thing. I think the decisive moment for China reunifying with Taiwan won't come with a kind of great ceremony with People's Liberation Army troops, goose-stepping through Taipei, or some kind of future government signing away their independence, their kind of, their instrument of surrender or whatever. It will come through something like a trade agreement. So what will happen is China will offer fairly generous terms to Taipei for a trade agreement, which really will help boost the Taiwanese economy, because it offers a whole range of goodies that will in the long term really boost the Taiwanese economy. But then annexed onto that, there'll be some kind of like security arrangement where, like, annexed on, the Taiwanese will commit to removing all US bases on and around Taiwan within like 2 years or something like that. Or like they'll agree that the People's Liberation Army Navy will be responsible for policing Taiwanese trade lanes, right? That's what it'll be. It'll be some kind of like quite quiet little treaty on trade, but it will put Taiwan on some rail tracks that ultimately lead to unification. And you won't be able to avoid that because you're on train tracks. The only way to do it will be some kind of explosion that knocks the whole train off the train tracks. But if they stay on those train tracks, it'll lead to the terminus, which will be unification. And that trade deal will put Taiwan there. That's what to look for, is something like that over the next couple of years, let's say.
Over the next couple of weeks, it'll be the energy trade deal.
Yeah, well, yes, exactly. That's exactly right. Like China could agree to sell refined jet fuel and diesel and petrol, which China is, I think, has the biggest oil refining capacity in the world, even greater than the USA. So, and it is a net exporter of all of those refined oil goods. So it could, in theory, quite easily provide Taiwan with a get-out-of-jail-free clause in exchange for, say, removing US bases from Taiwan, or in exchange for signing an overall trade deal, which puts Taiwan on a kind of inevitable course towards reunification, because once you sign that trade deal and once you integrate to that depth with the Chinese market, it would just become so damn expensive to exfiltrate yourself, so economically disastrous to exfiltrate yourself, that it just makes sense to keep going no matter what you think. Land of the falling bond.
So this week Bloomberg published a chart that showed the Japanese government bond yield climbing above the Chinese government bond yield. There's a 10-year bond yields, and this has kind of started a while ago. 2025, Japan's been gradually seeing its inflation rate and so on rise, but it's become very dramatic since the beginning of the Gulf crisis, the oil crisis, energy crisis in the Gulf. Yields were coming down a little bit in Japan, and I think markets were hoping that they'd renormalize, and the new energy crisis has ensured that doesn't happen. For those that aren't that familiar with the Japanese bond market, as recently as before the war in Ukraine, the 10-year bond in Japan was yielding zero, effectively zero. Most interest rates, or I shouldn't say most, but many interest rates, short-term interest rates in Japan were negative. They were negative in real terms. So they were completely zero. And if you factor in the small amount of inflation that Japan experienced, they tended to be negative. And this has been an ongoing thing that goes right back to the popping of the twin bubble in the late 1980s, early 1990s in Japan, the housing bubble and the equity market bubble. And the longer term driver, in my opinion, is demographic. It's the fact that it has an aging population, and they've got this strange system in place, or they had this strange system in place until recently, where they moderate the wage growth of the workers. I'm not sure how intentional it is or not, but it certainly happens. And it means that you don't get the normal inflationary dynamics that you'd associate with an aging population, the likes that you see in Japan, which is quite advanced. But recently, that's all kind of coming apart. The first thing to note is that the yen, the Japanese currency, is in free fall. It's falling constantly. And, currencies fall, that's fine. But the yen is falling against a very strange backdrop. The first thing to note is that Japan runs a fairly large current account surplus. It's currently 2025 current account surplus was 4.7% of GDP. That's an extremely large current account surplus. And that means net inflows are coming into the country. More yen are being bought than are being sold on the trade account. Well, not quite on the trade account, and I'll get to that in a moment. And that's usually pretty bullish for your currency. Now, the interesting thing about the current account surplus in Japan is that it's not actually mostly a trade surplus. People still think to this day that Japan runs these big balance of trade surpluses because it's such a trading powerhouse and so on. That's not so true anymore. Since the Ukraine war, Japan has actually run, not consistently, but it's run fairly regular trade deficits, balance of trade deficits. That is the actual physical goods and services that are traded, real things, real work, money for work or money for products and so on. And that's because Japan is basically a big energy importer. So as the price of energy's gone up, the balance of trade in Japan has gone down. But this goes back to years of previous falls in competitiveness of Japanese products. And you'll probably know this intuitively. When I was young, the Japanese electronic products and the cars were the best in the world. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Sony was the best producer of music equipment, for example. And in terms of cars, okay, people may have preferred a Mercedes or a BMW, but no one really argued with the fact that the Japanese were building the most engineering precise and efficient vehicles. Of course, none of that's true anymore. You don't use Sony equipment anymore. You don't use Japanese electronics too much. Maybe there are still some in, advanced audio or something like that. If you go into a recording studio, maybe they're still using Yamaha or something like that. But day to day, the things that we're listening to music on aren't Japanese anymore. And the cars, while they're still pretty good, they're clearly being outstripped by Chinese producers and so on. So the current account surplus in Japan is interesting because, by process of elimination, we know if they're running a big current account surplus while they're running, not great balance of trade, it means that that's mainly financial dividend inflows. That's a legacy. A series of payments. Basically, what happened was when Japan was the big trading surplus country, they bought up a bunch of equities and ownership stakes in countries like Europe and countries like America, equity holdings in big corporates and so on. Japan's still a massive equity holder of foreign companies and so on. And so dividend payments and so on are still flowing into Japan and propping up the current account. So that's an interesting component in and of itself. Japan is a very weird economy in many ways. But still, those are inflows into the country and they should, in theory, prop up the currency. So at the same time as the current account looks healthy, maybe the balance of trade isn't as good as it used to be, but they're still riding high on their legacy of owning foreign companies and so on. The yen's in free fall. That's kind of weird. Well, the second issue is that the yen's in free fall at the same time as the interest rates are going up. Now, that's not impossible. That does happen in some countries, but it shows serious financial weaknesses, and it is unusual. And the third thing to note about Japan is that the yield curve is insanely steep. I mean insanely steep. So just looking over some of the yields here. So the yield on a 1 month bill, a short-term credit instrument of the Japanese government, is 0.77, while the yield on a 30-year bond is 4.16, close to the yield on an American asset, in effect. So what that means is that that's what a yield curve is. At the short end of the yield curve are the short-term borrowing rates. And they're still very low in Japan, probably signaling the fact that the Bank of Japan's still trying to keep a lid on these interest rates. And then as you go steeper up the curve, 5-year borrowing, 10-year borrowing, 20-year borrowing, 30-year borrowing, the yield curve just shoots upwards. And, you could say a number of things about that, but the real one to focus on there is that the markets are just pricing in something wholly different to what the Japanese monetary authorities are allowing for. The question is, will this all break? I don't know. I mean, on paper, Japan looks like it's in a healthier position than it has been in a while. It has a very large government debt load, but it does issue its own currency. It doesn't run a massive trade or current account deficit. In fact, it runs a current account surplus. And its government budget, actually, to the extent that it matters in Japan, which is debatable, has been coming down over the years. And, they used to run crazy current government budgets of 7, 8, 9% a year. It's currently around 2% or something like that. So it's very hard to tell with Japan. The only thing that I can say about Japan really moving forward is two things. Japan is the most extreme economy within the dollar-based system. And obviously it's not a dollar-based economy. It doesn't peg itself to US dollars. And its interest rates historically haven't been too related to the dollars. But it's stitched into the Wall Street model through the carry trade and so on. It's very much so in the American nexus. And it's the most extreme of those economies. It's the one that's kind of held on despite the fact that its financial system and its economy is increasingly weird. And so as the dollar system goes down, I expect that that's going to at least introduce some sort of volatility, some sort of difficulty into the Japanese economy. And I think we're going to start to see that in the next few years. My guess about how that manifests is the falling yen. I think that's pretty much what to look for. I think as the yen falls, Japanese living standards are just cratering. I was in China a while ago and, a couple of months ago, and the Chinese now go on holiday in Japan. That says to me it's turning into a little bit of a museum, to be honest. And maybe because a lot of things are produced domestically, except energy, of course, in Japan, people don't notice it as much, to the extent that you believe the inflation rates, which while they're rising, are still relatively low relative to the West. But maybe those inflation rates aren't capturing it. But my sense is Japan is getting structurally more and more poorer and poorer, and it's going to continue down this path for the next 10 years or so. Montezuma's other revenge.
This week, Philip, you drew attention on your X, formerly Twitter, account to a data point that showed Mexican birth rates are now lower than in the US. And one of the points you made about this was that it means that the kind of like the Latin-based immigration policy to make up for low US birth rates, to keep the economy juiced up with lower cost labor, didn't have long to go. Like if Mexico itself has incredibly low birth rates, then these, the availability of these great human flows from south to north are going to dwindle, which makes a lot of sense for me. And you said that if the US wants to continue that, it's going to have to shift the focus from the Latin countries to Africa, which is one of the few continents, of course, which still does have high birth rates and growing populations. One only has to look at the population forecasts for countries like Nigeria and the Congo by mid-century and the end of century to know that this is the case. I would add to that, of course, Philip, that countries like Mexico are also developing. So whatever you think about the former president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, better known as AMLO for obvious reasons. He did, between 2018 and 2024, quite significantly increase living standards. He lifted over 13 million people in Mexico out of poverty. He increased education rates. He increased the minimum wage. It was a very standard kind of Latin American pinko set of economic policies where he expanded social programs, he lifted the minimum wage, he increased labor and workers' rights. He changed some of the contracts that multinational corporations had in Mexico. And by doing that, he really did reduce poverty. I mean, he didn't have the kind of overall economic growth that perhaps he could have, but that wasn't bad either. The point is that he lifted a large number of people out of poverty, and that's why Claudia Sheinbaum managed to get elected as his directly chosen successor on a landslide. It wasn't just because of her personal charisma or whatever. It was because AMLO chose her, and he was fantastically popular, whatever anybody says. So, at the same time as you have decreasing birth rates, you also have improving living standards, which in and of itself will reduce the pressures to migrate northward. You also have, in other Central American countries, like the Bukele revolution, an increased amount of orderliness within that region. People are really taking the region in hand. But anyway, I'll leave you, Philip Pilkington, to discuss this in a little bit more depth.
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that, Mexico's population growth is being exaggerated, let's just put it that way. I did a quick AI search before we came on to see when the projections, these vaunted population projections that are like always wrong. Go back and check population projections going right back to the Second World War. They're an absurdity in a sense. The Mexico's population growth is projected to reach zero around 2053. Now, I looked at the actual population growth numbers themselves. They're down in 2026 to around 0.8% a year. To give some sense, they were 2 and a bit times that, 1.9% in 1990, and in 1970 they were like 4 times that, right? So they're already very low. Now, just eyeballing that growth rate chart, I think they're probably going to hit 0% by about 2035, maybe 2040 at a push. These population growth statistics, the projections tend to be absolutely terrible. So Mexico's not going to be growing very much in terms of population quite soon. It's still relatively poor, I'd say. So it's 78th in terms of PPP adjusted GDP, $26,600 a year. It's around the same as Azerbaijan or Armenia or something like that. A little bit below China. For a European context, it's significantly below Serbia, which is $34,000 a year. Now, I admit I've never been to Mexico, but my impression of it is that may be a bit of an exaggeration. I don't know, but I'll leave it up in the air. The United States, it would definitely be in their interest to talk down Mexico because they need it for labor extraction, effectively. Just putting that out there.
Sorry to interrupt, Philip, but the one of the reasons that might be an underestimate is just because of the sheer volume of drug money that goes into the country. So if you look at kind of documentary series, for example, about the way in which some of the cartels live, and you look at some of the cemeteries where these kind of hitmen or kingpins have been buried after they've been shot or taken out or whatever. And some of their mausoleums are more lavish. I mean, a lot of them are more lavish than my house. They're stunning things. There's a tremendous amount of money in Mexico that's simply not recorded in the official economic data. So it may well be that Mexico is living a lot better than the official data show, simply because of the scale of the illicit economy. I'm sorry to interrupt there, but that might be an answer to the question that you posed, Philip.
Yeah, another thing that comes to mind is they may be saying that their population's significantly bigger than it actually is. Nobody knows how many illegal immigrants are in the United States. They really don't. And so, all those illegal immigrants are probably still registered as existing in Mexico.
Right, there's a very similar thing with Poland and Ukraine, with with so many Ukrainians in Poland. Quite often the Ukrainian population data is a little bit overstated because those Ukrainians might still be registered in Ukraine even though they're living and working in Poland.
I suspect that there are some issues with the Romanian population data as well, but I think the Mexicans would be in the Ukraine category. I mean, like the amount of illegal migrants that have gone from Mexico to the United States are legendary. I mean, I could tell some funny stories about when I went over to America and I hadn't got my visa yet, and I went into a bank, pretty leading bank that I won't name, and they had a specialist to deal with my set of circumstances who was a fluent Spanish speaker. Let's just put it that way. The entire American economy is set up to deal with the illegal flows from the south. To call them illegal is almost incorrect because they're so tolerated. So there are multiple reasons to think that maybe the per capita GDP numbers aren't 100% correct. I just echo what you said. Since since the 1990s, since the 2000s, there's been enormous growth in Mexico, and I can only see that continuing. A big decision that Mexico will make is how much they're going to engage with China in the future, and that's really one to watch. But look, the fact of the matter is that there just won't be as many Mexicans. Now, can the government keep them there? Can they stop the brain and bio drain, or whatever you want to call it, into the United States? We'll see. But if there are less people, then there'll be less people to migrate in a sense. And I think that brings us to the overall point of covering this story. And I'll rib on the Americans here a little bit. The Americans have always been a bit snobby relative to the Europeans about immigration. This used to manifest itself as kind of turning up their nose and saying, why do the Europeans get so mad about migration? Why do the European populations get so mad about migration? And they'll point to that little poem or whatever it is on the Statue of Liberty saying, send us your poor, your needy, whatever it is. And they'll say, we've been doing this for years. We've been doing this for years. Why do these Europeans care so much? And the standard response to that has always been, well, we're getting much more culturally different populations because they're from the Middle East and North Africa, whereas you used to get European migrants. That was your first wave of migration in the late 19th and early 20th century. And now you're getting relatively culturally similar Catholic populations effectively from Latin America. And there's some truth to that, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But I still think that the United States underplay how disruptive migration's been for their country. Both the waves recently and the wave in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think that the reason that America has such high crime rates, and I've looked into this quite deeply, and I think it's true, is because of these huge migration waves. I actually think that the gangster movies of the 1920s and 1930s was a relabeling of ethnic tension. I think that these so-called gangs, it was ethnic violence. It was Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, Italian gangs, and they were fighting each other. And, that's what you see when ethnic tension. And if you want to say, oh, well, that's just gangs fighting each other, I invite you to go to the Balkans, guys. I mean, that's how it starts. Go up to Northern Ireland and see how the violence starts. It doesn't start with paramilitaries. It starts with gangs, effectively. Gangs of young people, then developing into gangs of older people and so on. So I think America's always downplayed the impact that immigration's had on its society. But to the extent that what they say is true, and they say, well, or what the Europeans say about the Americans is true, and they say, well, you're getting much more culturally similar people into your country, and so it's not changing as much the landscape of your country. Well, that's not going to be true anymore, as you just said. The population growth centers are, the places that you just said, mainly Africa, but also to a certain extent some of the Middle East. And so that's where the migrants will start to come from the United States. And I think actually in the next 10 to 15 years, the United States is going to see some of the same migration flows as we're seeing in Europe. Maybe not as intensive at first, but I think they'll start. I think they've actually already started. You do actually see much more people, especially from Africa, going to the United States, from Côte d'Ivoire and so on. Probably butchered the pronunciation of that island off the west coast of Africa. I apologize to French speakers and to anyone who lives on that island. But, Ivory Coast, we should say. You do see mass migration flows already going from there. You see taxi drivers in New York City, taxi drivers in Boston and so on, even when I lived there 10 years ago or 8 years ago or whenever it was the last time I lived there. But I think that snobbery's gradually gonna melt away, and I think it's also coming at a time when migration is allowed to be a topic again in the United States. People really have to understand Europe's been fairly homogeneous for a long time, and then it had a big hit of migration in the 1990s and early 2000s and, up until today. And, it was verboten to talk about it for a long time, but that was mainly an American import. People, were talking about it privately quite quickly. In America, that's not true. After the migration waves of the late 19th and early 20th century, even discussing migration was incredibly controversial in the United States. The Trump movement since 2016, the MAGA movement, have opened migration, specifically illegal migration, but I suspect this is starting to bleed into legal migration now. H-1B visas, very large amounts of people from India moving to the United States. These are all becoming highly political issues. That's only going to increase. And I'm not sure if America's really dealt with this type of crisis before. I think pointing to the late 19th and early 20th European migrations, or pointing to the little poem on the Statue of Liberty, is not going to get you very far. So, in my opinion, all these countries should be trying to get their birth rates up and moderating the immigration a little bit to ensure that it doesn't create severe political instability. But there doesn't seem to be much appetite for that. So the only thing I could say to the Americans, American policymakers or anything like that, is if you're looking at numbers that are telling you population growth in Mexico is going to be positive until 2053 or whatever these nonsense projections are telling you, I'd just say get real, plan accordingly.